Welcome to Module 3 of our Programming Logic course. So far, we've been laying the foundation for like how computers work and how we as programmers communicate with them. But today, we're going to discuss one of the most fundamental ideas in programming, the IPO model. And it stands for Input, Processing, and Output. Now, I know IPO might sound like just another acronym, for you to memorize. But here's the thing. If you truly understand IPO, you'll understand how all programs work, from like the simplest calculator app, on your phone to like massive systems like Amazon's online store. Now, by the end of this lecture, you'll be able to define input, processing, and output. You'll be able to recognize examples of IPO in real-world systems and build an IPO chart to represent a program. And this is going to prepare you directly for your assignment where you're going to design an IPO chart for like a scenario, a bakery system. So I want you to pay close attention. Today is going to be kind of hands-on as far as I'd like for you to kind of think about some of the things that I'm talking about. And then you'll see how to go from like a real world business problem to a structured plan that a computer should follow. Okay, so let's start with the basics. So every single program, no matter how big or small, can be broken down into these three things. You're going to have your input, okay? And that's what information that we feed into the program. Then you've got your processing, and this is what the program is going to do with that information. And then you've got your output, and that's the result that the program produces. So it's almost like, say, a vending machine. The input is you pressing the button, for whatever soda you want and inserting like your money or showing your swiping your credit card or whatever. Now, the processing is the machine checking, do you have enough money? Did you put enough money in a machine? Is the soda actually in stock? And then if yes, then it deducts your money and then prepares the product. And then the output, of course, is the soda that's being dispensed. So sounds simple, right? But this exact same structure happens in much more complex systems. So, for example, let's take Amazon. When you check out at Amazon, your input is what? Your shopping cart, and then your payment information. That's the information that you're feeding into the program. Now, the processing happens when Amazon is checking its inventory, and of course, seeing if your product is available, that type of thing. Calculating maybe the shipping, applying any kind of taxes, and then, of course, charging your card. And then, of course, the output is the order confirmation and maybe even an email receipt that you get. So this input processing output cycle, you kind of think of it as the heartbeat of the computer. Okay. Now, I want you to think about something that you did this morning, with technology, maybe using your phone, driving your car, or logging into your email. Okay, so think about those type of things. Okay, so I want you to think about like what would be the input? That would be the information that was fed into the program. What would be the processing part? What is the program, does with that information? And then of course the output is what the program produces. So if I look at like this morning, I checked my weather app, to see, what the weather was going to be. So the input was, I had to tell the weather app, like what my location was. I got it from my GPS, but it was still considered input. Okay. The processing part was it retrieving like the forecast, retrieving like what met based on the input that I gave it, based on my location, and of course today's date, what would be the forecast? And then the output was to actually display the temperature. Okay. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to take a deeper dive into each piece of that IPO. Okay, so let's first talk about input. Okay, so input is raw data. It's not useful yet, but it's the starting point. Input can come from various different places. It can be something that maybe your user types, like maybe entering their name or something like that. It can be a device reading data, like maybe even a barcode scanner, like at the stores. It can be a file, like uploading maybe a CSV spreadsheet or something. And it can even be like sensors, like a thermometer, that's reporting like whatever the temperature is. The important thing is input. Inputs are what the program needs to do its job. You know, Now, here's a key tip. When you build an IPO chart, okay, what you're going to be doing for this week's assignment, I want you to always be specific. Don't just say input. You know, you and you should say data. So it's not just input, but it's data. Instead of saying like, input, maybe say customer name. Product quantity. Payment amount you know specifics these specific inputs, they make your chart more useful. So don't just say input. I want you to be specific about what that input is. Now, for processing, remember, processing is the logic. Okay, these are the action steps that the program takes with the input. Okay, so processing can include maybe calculations, like adding, subtracting, multiplying, dividing. It can be decision making, like a bunch of if statements, if this is true, then do this. It can be comparisons, A equals B, or conditions if A equals B, those type of things, or where A equals B. So it can be decision making is part of processing. Sorting or rearranging data is part of processing. Storing or even retrieving data from like a memory or even like a database is processing. This is the brain work of the program. Without the processing, inputs are just numbers and words. And finally, output. Outputs are what the user sees, hears, or receives at the end. So output could be numbers, on the calculator screen, after it's done processing, the information. It could be a printed receipt. It could be a confirmation message on your phone. It can be a flashing light, say on a device. Okay. Output should always be useful information, not just raw data. Okay. The whole point of programming is to transform input data into meaningful output. Okay, so I want to test this. I want you to test it with a login example here. Okay, so this is what we would use to sign into like maybe a secure area or something like that. So for a login system, what are the inputs? I want you to think about that. Okay, so if you said maybe username and password, it could be more than that, but for a basic login system, entering the username and password, that's the input. Okay, now what is the processing? Okay, so the processing is checking the username, and the password against like whatever maybe stored values there are, making sure that it's correct. Okay, and last, what is the output? So the output would be, to access granted or a denied message, giving them access to whatever they're trying to log into or giving them some kind of message that's denying them access. Okay, so that's IPO in action. So how do we capture IPO in a way that's easy to read? And this is where the IPO chart comes in. Now, an IPO chart, it's a simple table with 3 columns, okay? Input column, processing column, output column. Um, it looks, almost too simple, but what it does is it forces us to organize our thinking. Okay, so here's an example for a calculator that just maybe adds 2 numbers. So for the input in that column, we'll say, one of the input data is a first name, and then another one is the second name. Okay, the processing is basically adding the first and the second numbers, and then the output is going to be the sum of the numbers. Now, this little chart or this simple chart tells the story of the whole program without writing a single code. And that's the power of IPO. Okay, now a few warnings, and here's some common mistakes that students make with their IPO charts. One mistake is listing outputs as inputs. So don't say the total amount due is an input. It's not. It's the result. Okay. The other one is being too vague. Again, don't just say input, items. Be clear. If it's cupcakes, like in the scenario you're going to be doing for your assignment, then say cupcakes or cookies or muffins. Don't just say input items. Okay. The next one is skipping steps. In processing, don't just write calculate. Show the actual steps. Multiply, add, apply tax. Break it down. Okay. And then another issue that I see is making it too much like code. Remember, IPO charts, they use plain language, not any kind of programming syntax. So I always say, think about like if you were talking to a child, or someone that really didn't understand, how to so for instance a calculator would work. So you'd have to say, that you add, the first number and the second number, things like that. Okay, so before we kind of move on, I want to practice one more with you. So I want you to think about an online food delivery app like DoorDash or Grubhub or Uber Eats. So what would be some inputs? Okay, so items ordered, the delivery address, payment information. These would all be input that we would give to the app. Okay, what would processing look like? Okay, so calculating the total, checking the restaurant's availability, for what you ordered, assigning a driver. And then last, what would output be? So that would be like your order confirmation, the estimated delivery time, okay? And then maybe your receipt. So again, this example shows how IPO applies not just to simple programs, but say to large systems as well. Okay, let's wrap it up. So today we learned that IPO stands for what? Input, processing, and output. And again, these are the foundations of all programming logic. Now, input, what is raw data? Processing is the logic, and output is the result. Now, IPO charts, remember, they're simple tools that help us to clearly plan out our program before we even start writing any line of code. Okay, so we practice this with calculators. We practice defining an IPO for a login system, and you'll be practicing this for a bakery scenario. Okay, and we also practice it for the food delivery. Okay, so your assignment is going to be to create an IPO for a fictional bakery, Sweet Treats Bakery. So I want you to be detailed in your input. I want you to list every processing step clearly and make sure that your outputs are meaningful. Now, if you can master IPO charts, you'll have one of probably the most important skills in programming logic. So next week, what we'll do is we'll use IPOs as a springboard into flowcharts and start kind of visualizing our programming logic with diagrams and things like that. And this is where we'll see that the steps flow from start to finish. Okay, so now that we've learned about the IPO model, which again is the input, processing, and output, we're going to practice by applying it to something that you use in your daily life. So for this week's discussion, I want you to pick a simple application or device that you're familiar with. So it could be like a coffee machine, an ATM, a calculator, a microwave, a vending machine, whatever. And then in your initial post, you're going to identify your chosen application. You're going to describe the input, what information or data goes in. You're going to describe the processing, what steps or actions happen behind the scene. And then you're going to describe the output, what the user receives as a result. So I want you to be specific as you can. For example, instead of just saying input money, okay, you might say that the input is a dollar bill inserted into the vending machine. Okay, that's how specific I want you to be. Okay, now your post should be at least maybe 1 to 2 paragraphs in length. And, if you want, however you want to structure it, with bullets or whatever the case is to say what the input, processing, or output is fine. And then I want you to reply to at least 2 classmates. And in your reply, I want you to compare your chosen system with theirs. Are there similarities on how the input, processing, and output is structured? Did they identify something that you missed maybe in your own system? Okay. And then next, once you've practiced this with the discussion post, then you're going to be ready to create a clear IPO chart for the scenario that is part of this week. So for the discussion, you're not going to be creating an IPO chart. You're just going to be kind of writing it out. Okay. Like I said, write it out in an organized way, though, okay, so that your peers can be able to read it. But then your first experience with an IPO chart is going to be the assignment for this week. Okay, so the first thing you're going to do is you're going to read over the scenario carefully. So let's do that. So, and all the information that you need is going to be found in this scenario. So, a small bakery, Sweet Treats, wants to develop a simple system to calculate customer orders. So, the bakery sells cupcakes at $3 each, cookies at $2 each, and muffins at $2.50 each. And the system should accept the quantities for each product as input, calculate the subtotal, apply 8% sales tax, and display the final total amount due. Okay, so again, reread that scenario, take a look at it, dissect it, and then you're going to create an IPO chart to represent the bakery's order system. So remember, you're going to have that table. Okay, so you're going to identify like what are the inputs, identify like what information the program needs to gather. Then you're going to define the calculations the program must perform. This is the processing part. Okay, and then your output, what you put in your output columns are going to be what you identify, what the information, say, the program will display to the user. Again, you're going to present this IPO chart, and I want you to present it in a clear and organized table format, very similar to what I already showed you. And then you're going to submit the IPO chart as a Word document or a PDF. So again, it needs to be in a table format, okay, so unlike the discussion post. Okay, so here's some tips to keep in mind as you kind of transition into building your IPO chart. Again, be specific. Okay, just like in the discussion, name each input clearly. Cupcake quantity instead of just saying items. Okay, list each processing step. Don't just say calculate total. Break it down into smaller pieces. Multiply, add, apply tax. Okay, keep your outputs separate. Outputs are always the result at the end. They do not belong in the input column. And then I want you to think like a user. What information would you need to provide? What results would you expect to see? Okay. So if you've hung in here with me with this lecture, I'm kind of give you a kind of a bonus. We're going to kind of go through this, okay, together in doing this assignment, okay? So let's apply what we've learned about the IPO to this assignment scenario, okay? So again, everything you need is in this scenario here. So cookies are $3 each. I'm sorry, cupcakes are $3 each. Cookies are $2 each, and muffins are $2.50. And it tells us that the system needs to accept the quantities of each of those products, okay? And that's going to be our output. It needs to calculate the subtotal, and it needs to apply 8% sales tax and then display the total amount due. Okay, so let's break this down together, okay? So for our input, what's our input? We're going to need to know how many cupcakes, right? We're going to need to know the number of cookies. We're going to need to know the number of muffins. Okay, so that's going to be our input. Okay, and then for processing, what we're going to do is our system is going to multiply that number of cupcakes by $3. Okay, and then we're going to do the same thing for the number of cookies, multiplying it by $2. We're going to say that we need to multiply the number of muffins by 250. Okay. And then once it does that, then what does it got to do? It got to add all of those up. That's also part of the processing. It's got to add all of those up to become part of our subtotal. Okay. So subtotal is going to be, processing is going to be subtotal equals what? Cupcakes plus cookies plus muffins, those type of things. Okay. Then you're going to calculate the tax, and that's going to be taking the subtotal and multiplying it by that 8%. Okay, so 0.08. And then you're going to calculate the total, okay, which is going to be the subtotal plus the tax. So all of that's going to be our processing, that multiplying and then adding up for the subtotal and then calculating the tax, and I want you to be specific. Don't just say calculate tax. I want you to say what it is that has to happen. The subtotal has to be multiplied by, 0.08, okay? And then what's our output? Our output is going to be what? The subtotal, because we're going to give them the subtotal. We're going to give them the sales tax, okay? Because we don't just give, when you deal with an e-commerce app or something like that, you don't just get or even look at a receipt. It doesn't just tell you the total. It tells you what the subtotal is. It tells you what the sales tax is, and it tells you what the final total is. So those three items are going to be our output, okay? So again, kind of gave it to you. So what you need to do is take that and organize that into your IPO chart. Okay. And that would be what the assignment would, for your assignment. And then go ahead and submit your assignment. Okay. So if you have any questions, please reach out to me. But other than that, have a good week.